Hello and welcome to Varn Vlog. And there are two series, or three series actually, and I'm going to be running here on Varn Vlog Solo for a while. Now, I'm writing a book with a friend of mine, R.L. Smith, and that is E-L-L-E Smith, called Barbarians. And while the title sounds all cool and sexy, what it actually is an analysis of how concepts and systems break down. And it starts with just some basic questions. What is a system? What is politics? What is ethics? What is virtue? Um, what is material analysis? These kinds of questions that you see me deal with here. The other series is going to be one that was originally a long, about 2 hour solo episode on third worldism. And what I realized going into that show is there was a bunch of theories of third worldism that people kind of use interchangeably that aren't interchangeable. Just like I've talked about with imperialism way back in the day, like 5 or 6 years ago with Theorizing with a Hammer, that pretty much all leftists agree that imperialism is real, but the criterion by which they judge what is imperialism or not when it's not outright colonialism actually varies very greatly, and it's rarely talked about in a coherent way, almost deliberately as if to avoid having to deal with some of the facts that the paradigms that people use don't always work cleanly. Third worldism being tied into people's understanding of imperialism and also understanding capital, etc., will be something that's going to open up a lot of cans of worms. And even in my discussion in it, I said, a lot of people want to throw the third world's complaints completely out the window, and you can't for all of them. But also what you realize is not all third worldists are talking about the same thing. Some of them think the first world has a place in the future revolution, some don't. Some are basically trolling, and some appeal to the resentment of white working class professionals who want to romanticize places elsewhere, where others really are organic to the areas in which they are talking about. So we have two very big projects, and then I have my other project, which is on Volman, which is kind of my response to his, 6,000 page analysis of political violence. So those are three series that are going to be ongoing for a while. I'll go back and do my normal rants too, but in the spirit of actually, not working myself to death, and since I'm writing a book, working through some of these ideas on politics would be useful here. And while my book will actually probably go into less detail than what I'm going to go to on the show, not more. I will say that I've been struggling with a lot of things that I hear. So I used to listen to critical theorists who say that isn't political, that's subpolitical, or that's apolitical. It's not really politics. Or they'll say the personal is political and the more common variants, although they don't mean what the original authors meant by that term. And I've already covered that on the show as well. Went back and looked at the essay where that came from, and it's not the way it was used in the 1980s and 1990s. Now, for those of you who go, oh, Varn, this is some weird kind of authorial intent fallacy or genetic fallacy. No, it isn't. I'm not saying that the phrase is stuck in time with its original instantiation. I'm saying, though, that you can't go back and read that into the original works. And so too would politics. What do we mean by politics? Now, when I sat down to write this little outline for this video in the ancients, I almost went back to kinship anthropology, rulers, and consensus communities and tribes. In fact, I started digging out my Marshall Solins and my David Graeber, who some early Michael Hudson, some stuff on pre-agricultural political communities. But then I realized that muddles the water here, because the categories of politics as politics, that term really is from the ancient Mediterranean, which was a complex that we can't really say to be European, picked up through the Christendom, and then developed in Enlightenment Europe. Now, I use that very clearly because a lot of people think of all those as one thing. Like, oh, the deadest, whitest European men are the ancient Greeks, but part of the ancient Greek world is in Libya, in Cyrenaica, are in Egypt, Alexandria, are in the Asia Minor, and all over what would now be called the Levant. Um, Definitely in Anatolia and what would now be Turkey. And the Hellenistic world goes all the way to Gandhara and Bactria, which are within now Pakistan and Afghanistan, and were hybrid Hellenistic Buddhist cultures, all the way to, again, would now be Tunisia. So, is it really European? Not really. In fact, that term doesn't actually start getting picked up in common use until the fall of Constantinople. As I've said, both whiteness and Europeanness have a Christendom-shaped hole in their heart. So what you can talk about them is the ancient Mediterranean, right? And maybe the ancient Near East. There's also developed polities and political thought in ancient India and in the various empires that became China. But again, those concepts aren't one-to-one to politics. So when I was like, okay, if I want to talk about governance, I can talk about all kinds of stuff. If I want to talk about states, I have to really start with the Treaty of Westphalia. If I want to talk about empires, we're going back to like the ancient Assyrians or something. The Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians, maybe the Nubians. So I really didn't want to start in any of these places. I decided to take uh, just admit a Eurocentric bias because the terms are Eurocentric, and start in Alan Ryan's, thing, and start in, the classical world in the ancient Mediterranean, Greece, Rome, Etruscans, Hittites, Egyptians. And politics as something separate from religion and cultus and habitus really doesn't come to being until what we might call the axial age, to use some mid-20th century anachronistic categories. When we talk about ancient political philosophy, we usually have to start with ancient Greece because the word political comes from polis, a city-state, which for Greeks were, the locus of human civilization and the principal area in which ethical fulfillment could be sought, because they were complicated enough to have rich social interactions, and to engage in military and economic activity. But they were also small enough that people mostly didn't know each other. Now, the early works that we have on this are mostly just secondary works on the various constitutions of Greek city-states, writings of laws and codes of laws. For example, you can go back to ancient Near East. We have the Code of Hammurabi and all this, and epics. We also have poems about civic bonds and justice going back to Hesiod, but that's still, maybe 8th century BCE. There is guidebooks for rulers, and there's lots of evidence of stillas of laws. But politics really comes on the theorization of politics, and that doesn't really happen until you have philosophy. And you kind of have two um, ways of thinking about it. You have the Platonic way of thinking about politics, which was about political expertise or political techne versus an ideal state or an ideal city state or an ideal um, civilization. Now, again, the idea of a nation state doesn't really apply here. We're too early for that. So, what is politics in ancient Greece? Um, what is it to the people of these city states? Because they have various structures. I mean, Sparta does not work like Athens, does not work like Thebes. Um, the the Mesopotamian and Persian empires also did not work exactly like each other, and definitely not like Greek city states. City states had constitutions which were given by a lawgiver, which structured the way a city state functioned. But the community was defined in certain ways. And the reason why we talk about the Platonic view of this and the Aristotelian view of this is that those are really the first systematic treatises. But the problem that you have when you get to the Platonic view is like the Republic and the Statesman, for example, are the two major writings by Plato on politics. The Republic is full of esoteric stories and things that we don't know if he's building symbolic or not, since we do know from extant writing later, particularly by Neoplatonists and whatnot, that there were esoteric readings of the Republic going back pretty early. And they were tied to people who had esoteric political teachings like the Pythagoreans. We don't even know if Pythagoras existed. There seems to be a consensus that he probably didn't. He was a semi-mythical figure. So it's hard to know when to take the speculative norms given by Plato as actually real political guidance. And that's actually even true for some of the laws. For example, Deuteronomic and Levitical law and, in the Torah, there's not a lot of evidence that it was ever actually applied universally. And as soon as it is applied, like in the Mishnah and then, under the exile arc, there's all kinds of ways that they're trying to change it, mitigate it, work their way out to the most either utopian or draconian elements of that law code. And there's also evidence that in some cases, law codes even predate states. Religious law codes in some ways worked as basic law codes for places that were kind of sometimes without rulership. Particularly if we were to take anything in like the Judges period of the Torah or then the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, as anything like a historical document, which again, that's a big question, how much we can and we can't. But those are tribal societies that basically run by warlords that have law codes that are imposed by religious figures on the warlords. So, these aren't really the kind of imagined communities of liberal nation states with even a common language and central sovereign exception and constitutional rulership. But when you get to the polis in ancient Greece, you have something kind of like that. But even that's a little bit deceptive when we talk about the politics of Aristotle. We're going to see that. So we see here that we can't really say politics is just what the state is, and we'll get to various definitions of states and what they're for. We can't see it's just the imposition of norms because that's ethics. It can't be separated from ethics and morality, but also isn't ethics and morality, even in the classical sources. Although, again, in Aristotle, there's a teleological relationship between the two. In fact, one is kind of the scale of the other, but they're not said to be the same thing. So you might go, Varn, this is all very confusing. No, that's why the term is confusing. Like when people say politics is downstream of culture, well, what is politics and what is culture? Culture is just what people do, the unstated rules of society, the tradition, the habitus, the habits, the social technologies that we pass on by mimesis and reinforcement. Or is it the laws? the stated formal laws, the de jure laws, the laws related to constitutional orders. But then what do you do about the fact that in almost all societies, there's multiple sources of law, some that have enforcement, some don't. But you talk about medieval societies, there's multiple people with legal jurisdictions, with courts and punishments and everything that overlap but aren't the same. So is that politics? It's not a nation state the way that we think about it. But the nation state does have weird overlasting nesting rules and laws. Laws that emerge from treaty, laws that are done by legislation. And then you have informal law codes, which might not seem like anything but norms, but can still wreck your life. So when we talk about what politics is, we do have to go through how this term has changed. And we do have to limit ourselves to a lot of ancient thinking. And while I would love to go into the politics of like Confucian and Taoist China and early Dharmic India and the various theories of republics and kingships and the various empires that existed in Southeast Asia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because I do get tired of Eurocentric bullshit as much as everyone else. The problem that I'd have is that sometimes I'm actually imposing Western ideas on those societies to talk about them in English. And if I go into deep structural stuff and deep anthropology on kinship, kings, rulers, tribal bands, and government, we get into all kinds of hypotheticals or trying to figure out what is universal from one society to another. Are there stages, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing I want to say, though, is as we go through Aristotle more than Plato, and I'll talk more about why I'm kind of skipping Plato here in this series, is that with Aristotle, you could read it superficially and it can sound like both conservative and liberal politics today. And the polis can sound a lot like a nation state. So I'm going to have to pick through and point out where they are alike, because a lot of the nation states and liberal polities that exist today are literally based on Aristotelian writings and the way that, early modern and Renaissance humanist read Aristotle. But also the ways in which that is anachronistic to read back on Aristotle in his own time. Now, I am not a specialist on ancient Greece. I'm not a specialist on politics, even though I've talked about it and read about it, whatever. And eventually we're going to have to get to stuff like, what does Marx's talk about politics? Because there's probably two separate theories of politics as a state in Marx, and then another theory of politics of revolution, and then another theory as politics as the maintenance of the mode of production, right? Or what is politics for Max Weber, or for Hobbes, or for whatever, and what's the purpose, what's guiding the norms, and where the description's coming from. So starting with Aristotle, we can really kind of break out a lot of the frameworks that have been altered over time and really see where the politics comes from. What is the system? What are we talking about when we talk about politics? Now, this is a 19-minute preface, and I'm going to end here. But we're going to be doing this for a while. And I'm going to use it to get into some political stuff that we don't normally talk about on here, because we're mostly talking about modern politics, or at least politics that are from the development of socialism in the early 17th century forward. So usually we're in like a very diverse and but very modern, very industrial, right before the Industrial Revolution to now sort of mode of talking about politics. But I've really gotten to think that for us to really get back into what politics is and to kind of parse what the fuck people are talking about, we're going to have to go back to the source and kind of see what the categories are, how they've changed, why they thought that. And then we might even have to go back into anthropology. It's not going to be purely linear even, but we're going to start with Aristotle, because I think that's where modern political science really kind of starts. because there's political techne, which political technique, and political episteme, a politica episteme, which is, what we might call political knowledge or political science, right? And then there's political philosophy. And the three have never really been removed from Western thinking, but also have never really been truly the same thing. I hope you find this helpful. As a weird preface, it's a long one, but to get you starting to think about the problem of what politics originally meant, not just governance, not just kinship relations, not just community or tradition or tribal bands, but politics. The running and administration of relatively complex societies that are fairly stable. And what that means, when Joseph Taper talks about noticing when a political entity moves from the ruler of a people, King of the Franks, to Kingdom of France, to First Republic. We can go into Braudel or any number of theorists and historians for this. I have my Braudel back there, so maybe we will. But our next episode is going to be on Aristotle and Aristotelian political categories and its relationship to ethics, because I actually think a lot of people are kind of folk Aristotelians in a bad way, but they don't really understand what Aristotle was getting at either. And they don't even know that's where they're pulling it from. And as one of my favorite podcasts, The Constant, says, fucking Aristotle, you'll find that Aristotle is all over most late antique, medieval, early modern, and modern political thinking. So maybe starting with the bastard that started it all will help us figure it all out. But I'm going to alternate between this and my 13 ways of looking at a third worldism series, which won't be 13 ways. Actually, that's just a reference to a Wallace Stevens poem, because I like making poetic references and making my stuff impossible to search on SEOs. But nonetheless, all right. I'd like to thank all my patrons. You can like and subscribe for as little as $4. You'll get audio of everything. There's still shows behind the paywall. There's more radical engagement. There's a Parallax log, which I do with JD Michaels, and there is Diving into the Wreckage, which I do with Sean of Antifada. There's quarterly now Q&As. I used to do a monthly, but I don't anymore. My health doesn't preclude me doing this every weekend. And there's access to a Discord, which I'll let you in a Discord for free. I feel weird that people pay for Discord. So if you ask nicely and you obey the rules, you'll get into Discord for free. But in that Discord, there are things that are only for patrons, such as there's several book clubs. There's also several book clubs that are not for patrons that we just let anyone into. There's, I think, 2 Mark's text reading groups that I don't run even. It's run by my community, not me. And I let people propose what they like. So if you want into that community, you can subscribe for a little $4, or you can just ask me, send me an email. You're not gonna get the Patreon for that, but you might get into the Discord and just get along. All right, that's a long rambling thing. Come back, hear my notes on Aristotle. It's where we're gonna go. There might be a couple episodes on that. And thank you. Have a great day. Protect your peace. Keep your sanity. And as things get crazier, as I've been predicting for a long time, they will. Now we're like the things that when things actually get crazy, it's harder and harder to predict how they're going to do so. But when they do, just try to keep your head above water. Take care.